Good evening, and welcome back to the Sleepy Archive. Tonight, there is nothing you need to do at all. You don't need to remember the dates. You don't need to follow every detail. This is history told slowly, the kind you're allowed to fall asleep to. So settle in. Let the weight of the day go out of your shoulders. Let your breathing slow down. Tonight, we are walking out across a frozen clearing in the American backwoods, somewhere in the long cold century between 1790 and 1880, toward one small square of yellow light. Inside it, a family is getting ready for a night that will drop far below freezing, in a house made of nothing but trees, mud, and fire. We will move slowly through their winter, from the chinking of the walls to the banking of the coals, from the straw ticks in the loft to the gray light of morning. There is no hurry. We are not going anywhere in particular. Whenever you're ready, close your eyes. Let's begin. Imagine you are standing at the edge of a clearing on a still evening in early December. Behind you the woods go back in every direction, black trunks and gray snow, quiet in the way only deep timber is quiet. Ahead of you the ground opens into a rough square of stumps and old furrows, and in the middle of it stands a cabin, low and dark, with a stone chimney at one end and a thin white rope of smoke standing straight up from it into the cold. The snow between you and the door is a foot deep, crusted on top, where the sun softened it at noon and the frost took it back again. Your boots break through with a small dry sound at every step. The air has that particular winter sharpness that goes straight into the back of the nose, clean and faintly metallic, carrying only two smells across the whole clearing: wood smoke and the cold itself. The cabin is smaller than you expect. Perhaps 16 feet by 18, perhaps a little less. From the outside, it looks less like a house than like something the forest set down and forgot, a stack of squared logs the color of old bone, grayed by weather, chinked between with pale seams of clay. There is one door. There is one small window, and the window is not glass but a square of greased paper, glowing faintly amber from within, the way a lantern glows through a hand. Somewhere behind the cabin a cow shifts in a lean-to and lets out a long breath. A dog, invisible, thumps its tail once against a wall. And that is all there is out here. One family, one room, one fire. Between them and a night that will sink to 20 below, there is nothing but timber, mud, and the sense to keep the coals alive until morning. Consider the walls, because the walls are where all of it begins. A cabin like this one was built out of what was standing on the land, and it was built quickly, often in a single season, sometimes in a single week with the help of neighbors. The trees were felled in the cold months when the sap was down and the wood was lighter to drag. Oak, if there was oak. Chestnut, in the eastern hills, because chestnut split straight and rotted slowly. Pine and tamarack further north, A man would choose trunks of much the same thickness, 12 inches through if he could get them, and he would cut them all to the same length, and then he would notch the ends. That notching was the whole craft. There were no nails to spare on a frontier wall, and no time to make them. Instead, each log was cut near its end with a saddle or a V or a square notch, so that it dropped down over the log below and locked there under its own weight. Course after course, the walls rose that way, each layer settling into the last, the whole box growing heavier and tighter with every round. A well-notched wall would stand for 80 years. A badly notched one would let the wind in for as long as anybody lived in it. Round logs went up fastest, bark and all. A family with more time, or more pride, would hew the logs flat on two faces with a broadaxe, so the inner wall stood smooth and the joints came together closer. You can hear that difference in the old accounts. The hewn cabin, spoken of a little the way a person might speak of a good coat. By the time the walls stood shoulder high, the trees that made them had been alive and full of leaves 8 or 10 months earlier. That is how quickly a house came out of a forest. But logs are round, and rounds do not meet. Between every course there remained a long gap, sometimes a finger wide, sometimes wider than a hand, running the whole length of the wall. Through those gaps, in December, came the wind. So the family filled them. This was called chinking and daubing, and it was one of the plainest and most important labors of frontier life. First the chinking, wedges of split wood, flat stones, sticks, dry moss, corn cobs, rags, whatever was to hand, driven up into the gap to narrow it, and to give the mud something to grip. Then the daubing, which was clay, usually dug from a creek bank and worked with water until it was smooth, often mixed with straw or hog hair or ash to keep it from cracking as it dried. It was pressed into the seams by hand and smoothed with a stick or the flat of a palm. The result, from a little distance, is that striped look every log cabin has in old photographs. Dark timber, pale line, dark timber, pale line, going all the way up the wall. It never lasted a full year. Frost got into the clay and lifted it. Rain washed the lower seams. The logs themselves shrank as they seasoned, and the whole wall settled and opened new gaps by a quarter inch. So each autumn, before the hard weather, someone went round the outside of the house with a bucket and a stick and did it all again, filling every place where daylight showed through. There is an old test for it, mentioned again and again in the accounts. Late in the year, you go inside on a bright cold day and shut the door, and you stand still in the dim, and you look at the walls. Any line of light you can see is a place the wind will find at 3 in the morning. Then you go outside and you fill it. Above them, the roof. In its simplest form, it was a frame of poles laid from the ridge down to the eaves, and over that, split shakes, clapboards riven from a straight-grained oak or ash block with a froe and a mallet, 3 or 4 feet long, laid overlapping like the scales of a fish. There were no nails in the earliest of these roofs either. The shakes were held down by long poles, called weight poles or butting poles, laid across each course and pinned at the ends, so that the whole roof was simply pressed into place by its own timber. On a windy night the poles would knock, very slightly, and the sound came down into the room like something moving on the shingles. A roof like that leaked a little in a hard driving rain, and everyone knew it, and pots were set out, and nobody thought much of it. But in winter something else happened, and it worked in the family's favor. Snow fell on the roof and stayed there. 6 inches of it, then a foot, packed and settling, and every inch of that snow was a blanket. Still air trapped in snow is a very poor conductor of heat, which is the same reason a fox curls up in a drift instead of on top of it. The house lost less warmth through a snow-covered roof than through a bare one. So the deepest, most frightening weather also brought the cabin its best insulation. Families noticed this. They spoke of the house being warmer after the big snow than before it, and they were right, though the reasoning behind it would not be written down in a physics book for another lifetime yet. There is something quietly good in that. The same storm that pinned them indoors was, in its own slow way, tucking the roof in over their heads. The floor was the other problem, and it was the harder one, because heat rises and cold does not need to. Many of the first cabins had no floor at all. The ground inside was the ground outside, tamped down hard by feet, and swept with a twig broom until it took on a polished, almost slate-like surface. A well-kept dirt floor was smooth and clean, and it did not burn. It was also, in January, very cold, cold enough that a child sitting on it would be sent to fetch a sheepskin, cold enough that water spilled near the door would freeze there and stay frozen for a week. Families who had time laid puncheons instead. A puncheon was a log split in half, its flat face smoothed with an adze, laid flat side up on sleepers across the ground. It gave a solid, slightly wavy floor with dark seams between the boards, and it lifted the family a few inches out of the earth's chill. But the space under the boards filled with cold air, and that cold pressed up all night, and every account of frontier winters mentions the same simple truth. The temperature in a cabin was not one temperature. Near the fire at chest height, it might be pleasant. At the far wall, it might be near freezing. Down at ankle level, everywhere, it was cold, and it stayed cold, and it was why people sat with their feet on a stool, or on a stone warmed at the hearth, or on the dog. Sleeping on the floor was for summer. In winter, everything that mattered was raised. The beds on frames, the food on shelves, the babies in cradles with high sides. All of it lifted a foot or two out of the layer of cold that lay along the boards like standing water. There was, in most cabins, exactly one door. It was made of vertical boards pinned to 2 cross battens, hung on wooden hinges or on strips of leather, and it fitted its frame the way handmade things fit, well enough. Around its edges the family tacked strips of old blanket or cloth or dressed deerskin, so that the join was softened and the draft cut. At the bottom, a rolled rag lay along the sill all winter, pushed back into place a dozen times a day. The latch was a wooden bar that lifted from outside by a string passed through a hole. When the string was pulled in at night, the house was shut. That is where the old expression comes from. The latch string is always out, meaning you are welcome here. And in a country where the nearest other roof might be 4 miles off, it meant a good deal more than politeness. The window was small on purpose. Glass had to be carried in by wagon over hundreds of miles, and it was expensive, and it broke. So the opening was a foot or 2 square, sometimes closed with a sliding wooden shutter, sometimes covered with paper greased with bare fat or lard until it turned translucent. That paper let in a soft brown daylight, and no view at all. It also let in far less cold than glass would have. In the very hardest weeks the window was simply shut and stuffed and forgotten, and the room lived by firelight from dark to dark. We think of houses as things with views. This one had none. Its inhabitants knew the weather by sound, the pitch of the wind at the chimney, the creak of the roof poles, the particular silence that means the snow has started falling again in the night. Most cabins had a loft, and the loft is where the children slept. It was reached by pegs driven into the wall, or by a ladder of 2 poles and a few rungs, set beside the fireplace. Above the main room, a floor of poles or rough boards was laid across the joists, leaving a low, dim half-story under the slope of the roof, high enough to kneel in and not much higher. It was a strange place to sleep, and generations of Americans remembered it fondly for the rest of their lives. The warmest air in the whole house collected up there, gathering under the shakes, so the loft was the least cold bed in the cabin. But it was also the closest to the weather, and in a blizzard, fine dry snow blew in through the shingles and settled over the quilts in a thin white dust that did not melt. There are dozens of accounts of children waking to snow on the bed, shaking it off before it thawed, and thinking nothing of it. One old man, writing in his 70s, remembered the sound of it best, the hiss of snow coming through the roof and landing on the blankets an inch from his ear all night long. They slept 2 and 3 to a tick, head to foot, wrapped in whatever the family had. Below them, through the cracks in the loft floor, came the last of the firelight and the low voices of the adults, and the smell of wood smoke and the occasional pop of a coal. It is not hard to see why they remembered it. It was cold and rough, and there was snow on the quilt, and it was also, in the truest sense, safe. Close the door behind you now and stand still for a moment in the dim, because a cabin like this one had a smell, and everybody who grew up in one could describe it 50 years later without hesitating. Wood smoke first and always, in the walls, in the bedding, in the wool of everybody's clothes, so thoroughly that it stopped being a smell at all and simply became the smell of home. Under that, the resin of unseasoned logs, sharper near the newer chinking. Then bacon fat and ash from the hearth, and the sour-sweet trace of milk in a wooden pail, and the yeasty smell of dough set to rise. Above it all, hanging from the joists, the dried things, apple rings, herbs, onions, the faint peppery dust of sage and tansy, releasing a little more scent every time somebody's head brushed against them going past. And beneath everything, the damp earth of the floor and the animals just beyond the back wall, and wet wool drying at the fire, which is a smell nobody has ever managed to describe as pleasant, and everybody remembers fondly anyway. The light matched it. Not the flat, even light we live in, but a small pool of orange with everything beyond it in brown shadow, so that faces were lit only on one side, and the far corners of the room simply did not exist after dark. Objects came out of the dark when they were needed and went back into it afterwards. Children raised in that light grew up with a strong sense of the room being larger at night than in the day, which is one of those small facts that says more about a place than a page of measurements ever could. Stand in the middle of that room, then, and turn slowly, and see how little there is. One wall is the fireplace, wide and deep, taking up nearly the whole gable end. Around it, iron. A crane to swing the pot in and out of the flame. A bake kettle with a lipped lid for coals, a long-handled skillet, a poker, a shovel, a broom of hickory splints. On the mantel above, the candle box, the tinder, the family's few papers, and the rifle on 2 pegs. The far corner holds the bed, curtained in the better cabins with a hanging quilt. Along one wall, a plank table and benches, a shelf of wooden trenchers, and a few pieces of pewter, the water bucket with a gourd dipper floating in it. From the ceiling joists hang bunches of dried herbs, strings of dried apples and pumpkin rings, seed corn, a side of bacon, boots, and a spinning wool hoisted up out of the way. Under the bed, the trundle. Behind the door, the churn. In the corner, the chest that came in the wagon. That is the house. There is nothing in it that does not do something. And because there is only one room, there is only one place to be warm, which shapes everything about the way this family lives. They eat within 8 feet of the fire. They mend and spin and read within 8 feet of the fire. They sleep within 20. In summer they scatter across the whole clearing and hardly see one another between dawn and dark. In January they live, quite literally, in a circle of light about the size of a small kitchen. By 9 o'clock on a winter night, everyone in the cabin is inside that circle. The walls kept the wind out, and the roof kept the snow off, and the chinking closed the seams. But none of it made heat. For heat there was one thing only, and it took up an entire end of the house. The frontier fireplace was enormous by our standards. For it is 6 feet wide, 3 or 4 feet deep, tall enough for a grown woman to stand upright inside it while she swept the hearth. Where there was good stone, it was built of stone, laid up dry, or set in clay mortar. Where there was no stone, and there often was none out on the prairies and in the river bottoms, it was built of sticks. That is not a figure of speech. A stick and clay chimney, sometimes called a cat and clay chimney, was a lattice of split saplings built up like a small basket, then plastered inside and out with a thick coat of clay mixed with straw. The clay baked hard in the heat of the first fires and became, in effect, a rough ceramic. It worked. It also had to be watched and redaubed, and every family who had one knew exactly what it would do if the clay ever cracked through to the wood beneath. Inside the opening, the fire was not built on the ground but on a bed of its own ashes, several inches deep, kept there deliberately all winter and never fully swept out. Ash holds heat for hours. A hearth with a good ash bed came back to life in the morning. A hearth scraped clean went stone cold by 2. Above, the chimney throat drew the smoke up and out, and drew, along with it, a steady river of the room's warm air, which we will come to. For now, simply stand and look at it. It is the largest object these people own. It is the reason the house is here. Now, the arithmetic, because the arithmetic is quietly astonishing. An open fireplace of this kind, burning day and night through a northern winter, consumed something on the order of 15 to 30 cords of firewood a year. A cord is a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet deep, and 8 feet long, 128 cubic feet of solid wood. 20 cords is a wall of split timber 8 feet high and 40 feet long. Every stick of it was cut with an axe, split with a maul and wedge, hauled by sled or by ox, and stacked by hand, by the same few people who also had to raise the food, feed the animals, spin the cloth, and mind the children. It is estimated that a frontier household spent a substantial part of every single week of the year on firewood in one form or another. Not as a chore among chores, as the central labor of survival. Cold killed faster than hunger, and the woodpile was the difference. There was an old joke, worn smooth by repetition, that firewood warms you twice, once when you cut it, once when you burn it. Like most old jokes, it is a way of saying something true without complaining about it. The men and boys who spent November swinging an axe in the snow, in shirt sleeves, steaming in the cold air, understood the first warming very well. And when the pile behind the cabin was high and long and covered against the wet, the whole family felt it. It was not decoration. It was, precisely and countably, the number of nights they could survive. Not all of that timber was the same, and knowing the difference was the sort of knowledge every child absorbed without being taught. Dry, seasoned hardwood. Hickory, oak, ash, sugar maple, cut a year ahead and stacked under cover, burned hot and clean and gave real heat. Ash was famous for burning even when green, and there are rhymes about it that were still being recited in farm kitchens a century later. Hickory gave the most heat of all and the finest coals. Softwoods, pine and poplar, caught fast and burned out fast and threw sparks, so they were kindling, not fuel. Greenwood hissed and steamed and gave half the heat, but it had one great virtue. It burned slowly. So the fire was built out of both on purpose, like a machine with different parts. At the very back, against the stone, lay the back log, a great unsplit green log, sometimes 2 feet through, so heavy it had to be rolled in on skids or dragged by the ox right up to the door. That log was not there to blaze. It was there to sit and smolder and radiate and hold the heat in the back of the fireplace for a day and a night, and sometimes longer. In front of it, a smaller top log. Across the andirons, the 4-stick. And between them all, the working fire of split dry wood that did the cooking and gave the light. Fetching in the back log was a real event, usually the strongest job of the week, and in the Christmas customs of the old English-speaking world, it carried a whole ceremony with it. The Yule log, brought in with noise and lit from a saved fragment of last year's. Out in the American woods, ceremony or not, it was simply how you kept a room above freezing until Tuesday. Here is the plain truth about an open hearth, and every account from the period says it in one form or another. It was a magnificent thing to sit beside, and a very poor way to heat a house. Most of the heat of an open fire goes straight up the chimney. What reaches the room reaches it as radiation in a straight line, like light, which means it warms whatever it can see and nothing else. Stand facing the fire, and your face and chest are hot, uncomfortably so, near enough to scorch. Your back, for feet from the fire, is in air that may be close to freezing. Turn around, and the situation reverses exactly. And because the chimney is pulling a constant column of air up and out, that air has to be replaced, and it is replaced by cold air drawn in under the door, around the window, through every seam in the chinking. The better the fire drew, the harder the draft came in along the floor. So the whole room was a set of opposites. Roasting at the front, chill at the back. Warm at head height, freezing at the ankles. Ink froze on a table 8 feet from a roaring fire. Bread set to rise near the hearth had to be turned. In one much-quoted winter account from New England, a family recorded that the milk froze in the cupboard while the fire burned. People simply arranged their lives around it. Chairs had tall, solid backs. The settle, the wing chair, not for style but to make a small pocket of still, warm air and block the draft coming from behind. Screens were set up. Cloaks were worn indoors. The old and the very young got the places nearest the flame, and everybody knew the order without discussing it. Before the banking, though, the fire had one more job, and it did it 3 times a day. There was no stove in this house. Cast iron cook stoves came into ordinary American homes gradually through the middle of the century, and a great many frontier families cooked at an open hearth for their whole lives. Which means the cooking happened inside the fireplace, among the coals, with the flames pushed to one side. The iron crane swung out from the wall on a hinge, and the pot hung from it on an adjustable trammel hook, and it swung back and over the heat. In that pot went almost everything: beans and salt pork simmering for hours, corn mush stirred until the arm ached, stew, soup, boiling water. Beside it, set directly on a bed of raked coals, stood the bake kettle, sometimes called the Dutch oven. It had short legs to lift it above the embers and a lipped lid so that more coals could be shoveled on top, which meant heat came at the bread from below and above at once. Into that went the risen dough, and the lid was covered, and an hour later there was a round brown loaf with a thick crust. Johnny cake, simplest of all, was cornmeal and water and salt, spread on a board and propped up facing the flames until it set. The whole business was judged by hand and eye. A woman knew the fire was right for bread if she could hold her hand at the level of the coals for a slow count, and no longer. Nobody owned a thermometer. Nobody needed one. And the sound of it, all evening long, was a low mutter from the pot and the occasional soft collapse of coals under the kettle. Now comes the small ritual that this entire episode circles around. It happened every night, in every cabin, in tens of thousands of clearings, and almost nobody wrote it down because it was too ordinary to mention. At the end of the evening, when the talk had run out and the children were up in the loft, someone, often the mother, often the last one awake, banked the fire. It is done like this. The burning sticks are pushed to the back, against the back log, and the good red coals are raked together into a compact heap. Then the ashes, warm and gray and deep, are drawn over the coals with a shovel or a hoe, covering them entirely, sealing them in a mound. Perhaps a green stick is laid in among them. Buried in their own ash, starved of air, the coals cannot flame. But neither can they go out. They sit at a low smolder, holding their heat for 8, 10, 12 hours, dying so slowly that the mound is still hot in the middle when the room is cold enough to see your breath. There is a particular quiet that follows. The room, which has been full of leaping light all evening, goes dark by degrees, until the only illumination is a dull orange line at the edge of the ash mound, breathing very slightly, brightening and fading with the draft. That is the last thing anyone sees before sleep, not a flame. Just a warm shape in the dark, promising that tomorrow will start easier than it might have. And in the morning, the reverse, before anything else at all. The first person up, often the same woman, often before daylight, comes out of the bed into a room that has fallen to near freezing overnight. The water in the bucket has a skin of ice on it, or is frozen solid. Her breath shows. The floorboards are cold enough to burn the soles of the feet. She goes to the hearth in the dark, and she knows the way exactly, and she takes the shovel and opens the mound. Underneath, the coals are still alive, dull red, dusted gray, glowing brighter the moment air touches them. She rakes them together. She lays on fine shavings and dry bark, and she kneels down and blows. There is a moment there, in the pitch dark of 5 o'clock, with her face lit from below by a handful of embers, that describes frontier winter better than any other single image. The whole day depends on those coals. Breakfast depends on them, warmth depends on them. The drying of wet boots and the thawing of the water bucket depend on them. Then the shavings catch, with that soft tearing sound, and the light jumps up the chimney wall, and the room begins to come back. She feeds it slowly at first, sticks laid on like fuel into an engine, until the forestick catches and the backlog takes up again where it left off. By the time the others come down, or climb down, the worst of the cold has been pushed back to the corners, and there is a kettle on the crane. It happened this way something like 150 mornings a year, every year for a lifetime. Sometimes, though, the coals died. A shallow ash bed, a night colder than expected, a green backlog that smothered instead of smoldered, and the mound would be gray clean through at dawn, with no red left anywhere in it. In a house with matches, this is an inconvenience. In a house without them, it was a genuine crisis, and the accounts treated as one. Friction matches did not become cheap and common in America until the 1830s and 40s, and even then many rural families used them sparingly because they cost money, and money was the scarcest thing on a frontier farm. Before that, there was flint and steel and a tinderbox, a striker, a piece of flint, and a tin box of charred linen and dry tow. It worked. It also took patience and a steady hand and dry tinder, and on a damp January morning with numb fingers it might take a very long time. Which is why, when a family had a neighbor within reach, the simplest solution was the oldest one in the world. A child was bundled up and sent across the fields with a covered pan or an iron kettle to borrow fire, to carry home a few live coals from someone else's hearth, walking carefully, sheltering them from the wind, arriving with a pan of glowing red and a face stiff with cold. There are accounts of children walking 2 and 3 miles for this, and of the coals being handed over as a matter of course, without payment or comment, because next month it might go the other way. It is a small thing. It is also, when you sit with it a moment, the whole social contract of the frontier in one errand. And there was the other side of the fire, which every household lived beside without much comment. A wooden house heated by an open blaze, with a chimney that might be made of clay-daubed sticks, was a structure in a permanent, low-level argument with disaster. Soot and creosote built up inside the flue through the smoky months. When the layer grew thick enough and the fire hot enough, it caught, and the whole chimney would roar like a forge, throwing sparks up out of the top and down onto a roof of dry split shakes. The standard remedy was as homely as everything else here. Throw salt on the fire, or a wet blanket over the hearth to starve it, or climb up with a bucket. Families swept their own flues with a bundle of thorn branches on a rope, or by dropping a live goose down the chimney, which sounds like a joke and appears too often in the record to be one. House fires were common. Whole cabins went in 20 minutes, in the dark, in the snow, with nowhere to go. People slept a few feet from the thing most likely to kill them, and knew it, and went to sleep anyway, because the alternative was to freeze. So there is a kind of steadiness in this that is worth sitting with. Every night, that same hand banked the same coals with the same shovel, near enough to warm the room, buried deep enough not to burn the house down, in a margin perhaps 2 inches wide. They got it right, almost always, for 100 years. Let us go, then, to the bed itself, since that is where the night is spent. In the very first year of a homestead, there was often no bedstead at all, just ticks laid on the floor or on a platform of poles. But as soon as there was time, a frame went up, and the simplest and cleverest of them was called the bedstead in the corner. It used the cabin itself. 2 walls of the room made 2 sides of the bed. A single upright post was set in the floor at the far corner of where the bed would be, and 2 rails ran from that post into holes bored in the logs of each wall. That was the whole frame, 1 post, 2 rails, and the house. It could be built in an afternoon with an auger and an axe. Across the frame ran the ropes. A bed cord was a length of hemp rope, 40 or 50 feet of it, laced back and forth between pegs or holes in the rails in a lattice, and drawn as tight as a strong pair of arms could pull it. On top of that lattice went the mattress, rope stretches. Within a few weeks the lattice sagged in the middle and the sleepers rolled together into a hollow, and someone would fetch the bed key, a wooden lever made for the purpose, and go round the frame taking up the slack peg by peg until the ropes sang when you plucked them. That is where the phrase comes from, most likely, the one people still say to children at bedtime without knowing what it ever meant. Sleep tight. It meant a bed whose ropes had just been tightened, which was a bed that did not sag, and it was, in a small way, one of the good nights. On the ropes went the tick, a large cloth bag, sewn shut along 3 sides with an opening in the middle of the top, and stuffed with whatever the land gave. At the bottom of the scale, straw. Fresh wheat or oat straw, packed and hard, smelling faintly of the field. It was warm, it was free, and it was noisy. A straw tick rustles at every movement, a dry crackling sound that fills the room when someone turns over. It also packed down flat within a month, so it was emptied and refilled once or twice a year, and the old straw went to the animals. Above straw, corn husks, shredded from the dried shucks at husking time. Longer lasting, springier, and even louder. Above that, and only for a family that had been settled a while, feathers. A feather bed was a serious possession, built up over years from the down and small feathers of geese and ducks, plucked several times a season, saved in a sack, and eventually sewn into a great pillowy tick 2 feet deep. A feather bed was warm in a way nothing else was, because you sank into it, and it closed around you, and the down held your own heat against you all night. It was also property. Feather beds appear in wills. They were listed in inventories beside the ox and the plow, carried across the mountains in wagons when almost everything else was left behind, and given to daughters as the first furniture of their own households. The finest arrangement, for the fortunate, was both a straw tick underneath for support, a feather tick on top for warmth. In an unheated room at 10 below, that combination was worth more than any amount of firewood. Over the tick came the coverings, and here the household's whole textile year came to rest. There were sheets, if the family had linen, woven at home from flax they had grown, rent, broken, hackled, spun, and woven, which is 11 months of labor to describe in a single line. There were blankets of wool, from their own sheep, carded and spun in the winter evenings by the fire we have just been sitting beside. There were coverlets, woven in patterns with names that carried from Pennsylvania out to Ohio and Indiana, the wheel, the pine bloom, the double weave in indigo and madder. There were quilts, pieced from every scrap of worn-out clothing the family had ever owned, so that a quilt on a frontier bed was a kind of archive in itself, the sleeve of a dead man's shirt lying next to the hem of a child's outgrown dress. And on top of everything, in the cold months, the hides. A bearskin, if someone had shot a bear. Buffalo robes out west, traded or hunted, heavy as a rolled carpet and warm past belief. Deerskins sewn together. The result was a bed that weighed a very great deal. Sleepers described it as being pinned down, unable to turn easily, and this was not a complaint. Weight meant no gaps, and gaps were where the cold got in. You did not climb into a frontier bed so much as get underneath it. And once under, in the dark, with a foot of feathers below and 30 pounds of wool and hide above, you were in the warmest place for 20 miles. Now, who was in it? We have inherited a very modern idea that sleep is private. In a one-room cabin, it was nothing of the kind. The parents had the corner bed. Under it, on low wheels or wooden runners, was the trundle, a shallow second bed that slid out at night into the middle of the floor and back out of the way at dawn, and the smallest children slept there, within arm's reach of their mother in the dark. The older children went up the ladder to the loft, 2 and 3 to a tick, arranged head to foot to fit. A hired man, if there was one, slept by the fire on a pallet. A visiting preacher, a peddler, a neighbor caught out by weather, all of them were simply given a place on the floor with a quilt, and nobody thought it remarkable. Sleeping close was not merely tolerated. It was the point. 2 people under one set of blankets are far warmer than 2 people under 2, and a bed with 4 children in it stays warm all night on its own. In the coldest weeks, families deliberately doubled up. There was even a custom, much written about afterwards and much misunderstood, called bundling, in which a courting couple were permitted to lie down together fully dressed, sometimes with a board between them or the young woman sewn into a sack, and talk through the night in the only warm place in the house. It scandalized 19th century writers looking back. To the people doing it, in a house with one fire and no heated parlor, it was ordinary hospitality and ordinary economics. Privacy, in that room, was a matter of manners rather than walls. You turned your face to the logs. You did not look. Still, there was the problem of the first 10 minutes. A bed in an unheated corner of a cabin in January is genuinely cold. The sheets are cold, the tick is cold, and getting into it is a small ordeal that people put off, standing at the fire longer than they meant to. So they warmed it. The most elegant answer was the bed warmer, a long-handled brass or copper pan with a hinged perforated lid, filled with coals from the hearth and passed briskly back and forth between the sheets, held slightly off the cloth and never left still, because a warming pan left in one place scorched the linen and, once or twice in the record, set the bed on fire. Not every frontier family owned brass. The simpler versions were just as good. A flat stone, laid at the edge of the hearth all evening until it had drunk up the heat, then wrapped in flannel and pushed down to the foot of the bed. A brick heated in the ashes. A stoneware jug or a metal canteen filled with boiling water and corked. In one household after another, the same items appear: hot stone, hot brick, hot jug, carried to bed wrapped in a cloth, laid where the feet would find it. Cold feet keep a person awake. Warm feet make the rest of the body believe it is warm too, which is a piece of practical physiology that every grandmother on the continent knew perfectly well. And in a cabin where the dog was allowed inside, the dog was often the last and best solution of all, lying heavily across the foot of the bed, unbothered by the weather, radiating like a small stove until morning. They did not sleep in nothing, and they did not sleep in what they had worn that day. The standard night garment, for men and women both, was a long shift or nightshirt of linen or coarse cotton, reaching to the ankles, loose enough to be pulled on over the head in the dark. Children wore the same in smaller sizes, often cut down from an adult's worn-out one. And on the head, the nightcap, which strikes us now as comical and was in fact simply sensible. A great deal of the body's heat leaves through the head and neck, and the air a foot above a frontier pillow was near freezing. So men wore a plain knitted or linen cap, women a fitted cap tied under the chin, and children whatever their mother had made them, and they wore them all night, every night, from October to April. In the very worst weather, people went to bed in more than that, in stockings, in a second shift, in a shawl, and in the northern accounts, in nearly everything they owned, coats and all. There is one detail that recurs, and it is a good one. Tomorrow's clothes did not stay folded in a chest across the cold room. They were brought to the bed and laid under the covers or under the tick itself, so that in the morning they would be warm, or at least not stiff with frost, when the wearer had to put them on in a room at 20 degrees. Small kindnesses, done in the dark, for the version of yourself who would have to get up. Before the covers, there were the last few small things, done in a fixed order that hardly ever varied. The water bucket was moved away from the door and set near the hearth, so it might not be frozen through by morning. Wet boots and mittens were arranged at the edge of the fire, close enough to dry and far enough not to scorch, and someone always turned them once more on the way past. The next day's kindling was brought in and laid where it would be dry and findable in the dark. The dough for morning, if there was any, was set to rise in a covered bowl on the warm stone. The cat was put out or let in, depending on the household's politics. And there was the trip outside, which nobody looked forward to. There was no plumbing here of any kind. Either you went out into the snow in the dark, in boots pulled over bare feet, to the necessary house across the yard, with the wind coming through your shift, or you did not, and used the chamber pot kept under the bed, which was emptied in the morning and was, on a frontier farm, an entirely unremarkable object. In the deep cold, the accounts agree, almost nobody went outside after dark unless they had to. Then the door bar was dropped and the latch string pulled in, and the family listened for a moment to whatever the night was doing. And then the fire was banked, and the light went down to that single orange line under the ash. Lie there a moment, then, in the dark, and simply listen, because a cabin at 2 in the morning is not silent at all. The house itself makes noise. Green logs contract in extreme cold and let out sharp cracks like a distant gunshot, startling the first winter, ignored by the second. The roof poles shift and knock as the weight of snow settles. Somewhere a nail or a wooden pin creaks in its hole. The fire, banked and buried, gives out an occasional soft collapse as the ash mound settles inward on itself. Outside, the wind moves through the timber with a long, even sound, rising and falling, more like water than air. Now and then the cabin takes a gust squarely and the greased paper window drums for a second. A branch somewhere in the woods comes down under its own load of ice. In the lean-to, the cow shifts her weight and breathes. The horse stamps once. Farther off, wolves or coyotes, taking up a thin chorus and dropping it again, a sound that frightened newcomers and that people who had lived there 5 years slept straight through. And inside, closest of all, the family breathing. 4 or 6 or 8 people in one room, at different rhythms, the small quick breaths of a child in the trundle, the deep slow ones from the loft, someone turning over on a straw tick with a long dry rustle. It is not quiet, but it is all the same sounds, in the same order, night after night after night, and there is nothing in the world more restful than that. And there is one more thing about these nights, and it is a quiet one, and it belongs here at the end of the dark. People in houses like this did not always sleep the way we do, one long unbroken stretch from 11 until 7. In the long winter nights, before cheap lighting stretched the evening out, sleep very often came in 2 pieces. They went to bed early, not long after full dark, because there was nothing to stay up for and candles cost money. They slept deeply for 3 or 4 hours, what old writings call the first sleep. And then, somewhere near midnight, they woke. not with alarm. Just awake, in the dark, for an hour or so, with the house quiet around them and the coals under their ash. And in that hour, people did all sorts of ordinary things. They lay still and thought. They talked softly with whoever was beside them, in a way the daylight never allowed. They got up and put a stick on the fire, or checked a sick child, or stepped out to look at the weather. Some prayed. Some simply listened to the wind. Then they lay back down and went into the second sleep, which carried them through to first light. Historians have found this pattern described again and again in the older written record, and it fits everything about a house like this one. The early dark, the scarce light, the long nights of a northern winter. So if you are lying awake now, somewhere in the middle of the night, it may comfort you a little to know that for most of human history, that was not a problem at all. It was just the gap between the two sleeps, and people used it, and then they went back down. Step back a season now, out of the dark and into the low gold light of autumn, because the truth about a frontier winter is that it was survived long before it arrived. Nothing that happened in January could be fixed in January. If the wood was not cut, it could not be cut, because the snow was 3 feet deep and the axe hand was frozen. If the pork was not salted, there was no pork. If the roof was not patched and the chinking not renewed, then the family simply lived with the wind coming through until April. So the whole autumn was one long act of preparation, and it had an urgency to it that comes through in every diary of the period. From September onward, the entries get shorter and the verbs get harder. Cut, hauled, killed, salted, dug, banked. There was a phrase for the state everyone was working toward. Laid by. It meant the crops were in and the stores were full and the house was ready, and the family could stop and let the weather come. Some years, it did not get finished. A man broke a leg in October, or the rain never let up, or the family arrived on their claim too late in the season to do anything but throw up 4 walls and hope. Those were the winters that got remembered and written down and told to grandchildren. But in a good year, by the middle of November, everything was in its place, and there is a particular satisfaction in that which is difficult to reach in a life with grocery stores. The work was done. The cold could do what it liked. First, and above everything, the wood. The cutting began in earnest once the harvest was in and the leaves were down, and it went on through every dry day until the snow got too deep to work. 2 men with a crosscut saw, or 1 man with an axe, working steadily from gray light to dusk, felling, limbering, bucking the trunks into 4-foot lengths, splitting the big rounds with an iron wedge and a wooden maul. The lengths were hauled to the house by ox sled or by hand, and stacked in a long rick behind the cabin, on rails to keep them off the wet ground, with the split faces turned to shed the rain, and the whole pile crowned with slabs or bark or a rough thatch. It was arranged, too, in a way that mattered. kindling, and fine splits nearest the door. Good dry hardwood next. The great greenback logs left at the end where the ox could reach them. Because in February, at 10 below, in the dark, nobody should have to dig for anything. A boy's daily chore in thousands of households was to fill the wood box inside the door before supper, and to keep it filled, and this was the single most common cause of frontier scolding in the entire literature. And there was a kind of visible arithmetic in the pile. A family could stand in the yard on a November evening and look at it and know, roughly and honestly, whether they had enough. 2 short mint February would be spent out in the snow-cutting green, wood that would not burn properly. Long, high, and covered meant the fire would not go out. Then, at the first hard freeze, and not one day before it, came the butchering. This was timed by the weather, deliberately, because there was no ice house on most claims and no refrigeration of any kind. Meat had to be cut up and worked in air cold enough to keep it from spoiling for the several days the process took. People called it killing weather, and they watched for it, and when it came the whole household turned out at dawn. The hog was the center of it. Hogs ran half wild in the woods through summer, fattening on acorns and mast, and were brought in and pinned for a few weeks on corn. On the day, water was heated in a great kettle over an outdoor fire, and the work went on all day in the cold, the men at the scalding and scraping, the women at the tables with knives. Almost nothing was wasted. Hams and shoulders and sides went into salt, packed in a wooden trough or barrel with coarse salt and sometimes saltpetre, left for weeks, then hung in the smokehouse over a slow smoldering fire of hickory or corn cobs until they were dark and hard and would keep for a year. Fat was rendered into lard in a kettle and poured into crocks. Scraps became sausage, seasoned with sage from the garden. The head became souse. The intestines were cleaned for casings. Even the bristles were saved. By nightfall, everyone was exhausted and greasy and cold, and the meat for the entire coming year hung in the smoke. That smell. Hickory smoke and salt and rendering fat, on a cold, clear afternoon, is one that turns up again and again in the memoirs of people who left the frontier as children and never went back. Around the same weeks, the rest of the year's food was put away, and the cabin slowly filled up from the floor and from the ceiling at once. Below, if the family had dug one, was the root cellar, a hole under the floor with a trapdoor, or a bank cut into a hillside and roofed with logs and earth. Underground, a few feet down, the temperature holds near 40 degrees whatever the weather does above, which is exactly what potatoes and turnips and carrots and cabbages want. They were laid in straw or buried in sand, and taken up a basketful at a time all winter. Apples went down there too, spread so they did not touch, because one soft apple will take a whole barrel with it. Above, hanging from the joists in the warm, dry air near the roof, was everything that could be dried. Rings of apple, threaded on strings, shrinking and darkening for weeks. pumpkin cut in spirals and hung the same way. Strings of beans, called leather breeches, dried in the pot. Bunches of sage, thyme, tansy, boneset, pennyroyal, as much medicine as seasoning. Ears of seed corn braided by the shucks, saved for spring planting and guarded more carefully than food, because seed corn eaten in February meant no crop in July. And in crocks and barrels along the wall, sauerkraut, salt fish, pickled beans, sorghum molasses, honey if they had found a bee tree, cornmeal from the last trip to the mill. Stand in the doorway in mid-November, and the room is visibly fuller than it was in August. The house is packed like a ship before a long voyage, which is precisely what it is. The family were not the only ones who had to be got through the winter. There was usually a cow, and she mattered more than almost anything else, because milk and butter were the difference between plain living and hunger. There might be a yoke of oxen, the engine of the whole farm. A horse on a prosperous place. A few sheep for wool, a flock of hens, the hogs that had not been killed, and the dog. They needed shelter and they needed feed, and both had to be ready before the first storm. The barn, on an established farm, was often better built than the house, and there is nothing sentimental in that. A family could crowd around a fire, and a cow could not. Where there was no barn, there was a lean-to against the cabin's back wall, or a three-sided shed of poles and brush and stacked cornstalks, banked round with earth and open only to the south. Feed meant hay, cut with a scythe in July and stacked, and cornstalks saved from the harvest, and straw. Rationing it through a long winter was an anxious arithmetic that failed more often than anyone liked. Livestock died in bad years, and every account of a hard winter counts the animals lost alongside everything else. But there was one quiet benefit to keeping the stock close. A byre full of animals against the back wall of a cabin is a source of heat. A cow gives off something like the warmth of a small stove, all night, for nothing. In the oldest European farmhouses, the family and the beasts had shared one roof for exactly that reason. On the American frontier, the wall between them was often only one log thick, and on the coldest nights, that was not entirely accidental. There is one more autumn job, and it is the one that most directly bought them warm nights. Around the outside of the cabin, along the base of the walls, the family piled up a bank of insulation 2 or 3 feet high. Fallen leaves raked from the woods. Earth thrown up with a shovel. Manure from the barn, which had the additional virtue of generating a little heat of its own as it composted. Sawdust, if there was a mill nearby. Cornstalks stood up in a rough thatch and held in place with poles. This was called banking the house, and it cut off the very worst draft of all, the one that comes in at the join between the ground and the lowest logs, where no amount of clay ever seals completely. In some regions, the family went further and built a windbreak of stacked cornstalks or brush on the north and west sides, or planted a row of evergreens for the years to come, or shoveled snow itself up against the walls once it fell, because packed snow is a very good insulator and is delivered free. Inside, the same instinct. A quilt was hung across the door. Rag rugs were laid along the floor at the base of the walls. The unused window was stuffed with straw and covered with a board. By late November, the cabin has changed shape. It has thickened. It sits lower against the ground, skirted in leaves and earth and stalks, half buried, more like a burrow than a building. Which is exactly right. That is what it is for the next 4 months. One more thing had to be laid in, and it is easy to forget from a century with switches on the wall. Light. In midwinter, at those latitudes, darkness came before 5 in the afternoon and did not lift until 7 the next morning. 14 hours. Firelight covered some of it, but firelight is orange and unsteady and does not reach a corner. So autumn included candle making, and it was an entire day's work with a distinct smell. Tallow, beef and mutton fat, saved and rendered again to clean it, was melted in a kettle. Wicks of twisted cotton were tied to sticks in rows, and the sticks were dipped and lifted and hung to cool and dipped again, over and over, 40 or 50 times. Each pass adding a layer no thicker than paper, until the candles reached the width of a finger. A family might make 200 or 300 at a sitting and store them in a wooden candle box on the mantel, safe from mice, who would eat them. Beeswax was better and rarer. Sperm oil and whale oil lamps came later and cost money. And then, at the end of it all, one final errand, made with an eye on the sky. Somebody hitched the team and drove to the settlement. 10 miles, 20, 40, for the handful of things the farm could not make. Salt, above everything, because salt kept the meat and no frontier family could produce it. Coffee, if they drank it. A little sugar, or a cone of loaf sugar wrapped in blue paper. Powder and lead. Needles. A pane of glass. Perhaps, wrapped in straw and carried home on somebody's lap. A bolt of cloth. Nails. And whatever the wagon could carry of the neighbor's news, because after this trip there would not be another one for a long while. The road back would be frozen ruts by evening, the load creaking, the breath of the oxen standing in the air. And when the wagon came into the clearing and the goods were carried inside, something closed behind them. The family was, from that point until the thaw, largely alone. The nearest neighbor might be a mile off, or 5, and between them lay drifted snow and no road worth the name. Letters would not come. The mill was unreachable. If someone fell ill, the doctor, if there was a doctor at all within a day's ride, might not be reached in time, and everybody understood this and nobody said it aloud. There are diaries in which whole weeks pass with a single line, snowing. Stayed in. That is the state the rest of tonight takes place in. The house is stocked and banked and dark and warm. The world beyond the clearing has gone quiet and white and far away. And now the weather can begin. There is a particular sort of day, in January, out in that country, and by the second winter everybody could read it. The morning is still. Too still, no birds, and the smoke from the chimney goes up straight and then flattens out sideways at the height of the trees. The sky in the northwest is not blue and not gray, but a low, even white, the color of skimmed milk, with no edge to it anywhere. The air feels almost soft and slightly warmer than it should, and there is a smell to it that people described simply as the smell of snow. The animals know first. The cattle drift down to the shelter of the timber without being driven. The hens go in early. The dog wants indoors and stays under the table. And in the cabin, without any particular hurry, the day's plans quietly change. Whatever was going to be done outside is either done now or given up. There is no forecast to consult and no warning to be had. This family will find out how long this storm lasts by living through it. 1 day or 2, or in the very worst years, 3 or 4, with the wind never dropping and the snow never stopping. So the mother looks at the water bucket. The father looks at the woodpile and then at the sky, and then he goes to get the axe. And the older boy is sent to fetch the rope. That rope is one of the small, sober details of frontier winter that stays with you once you have heard it. In heavy snow, driven by a hard wind, visibility can drop to nothing at all. Not to a few yards, to nothing, a white blank with no ground, no sky, and no direction in it. The barn might be 60 feet from the kitchen door and be, in practical terms, unreachable. People died in that distance. It happened often enough in the Plain States to become one of the standard warnings passed from old settlers to new ones, and it is recorded in the papers after every great blizzard. So the answer was a line. A rope was run from the cabin door to the barn door and tied off hard at both ends before the weather closed in. Anyone going out to the animals took hold of it and did not let go, out with the feed bucket hand over hand, and back the same way, blind, with the wind taking the breath sideways out of the mouth. Alongside the rope, the same afternoon, everything else was made short. Firewood was carried in and stacked inside along the wall, several days' worth, so nobody would have to go out for it. Water was hauled from the spring or the creek and the barrel filled. The animals were given extra bedding and all the hay they could use. And then the door was shut, and the bar dropped, and the rag pushed against the sill. There is nothing frantic in any of the accounts of this. It reads more like the closing of a shop. Everything in, everything fastened, everything within reach, and then, simply, waiting. It comes on at dusk, usually, and it comes on gradually, so that nobody can say exactly when the storm started. The first sign is the note of the wind changing at the chimney, A low tone that was not there an hour ago, rising and falling, then rising again and not falling back. The fire, which has been burning steadily, begins to gutter and lean as the draft shifts. A puff of smoke comes down into the room and out into the air, and the mother waves it away and does not look up. Then the sound on the roof. Not the soft nothing of falling snow, but a dry, mineral hiss, fine hard grains driven flat across the shakes, thousands upon thousands of them, more like sand than like weather. The greased paper window goes dark, and then pale, as snow packs against it from the outside. Inside, the room settles into itself. Someone moves the bench a little closer to the hearth. The dog gets up, turns around, and lies down again against the hearthstone. The kettle is filled. The children, who are not frightened, because they have seen this before and the house has always held, are told to bring their work nearer the light. And the temperature in the corners begins, very slowly, to fall. That is the whole beginning of it. Not drama, just a house, tightening a little, as the noise outside gets steadily larger and there is nothing at all to be done about it. On a night like this, the fire is not banked. On an ordinary night, the coals go under the ash and everybody sleeps. But when the wind is pulling hard at the chimney and the cold is dropping past 20 below, a banked fire loses the argument. The draft strips the heat out of the room faster than the ash can hold it, and the house goes down to freezing by 2 o'clock with the water bucket solid and frost on the inside of the walls. So on the worst night, someone sat up. It was usually the father, sometimes the mother, sometimes the two of them by turns. A chair drawn near the hearth, a quilt around the shoulders, feet on a warm stone. Every hour or so, a stick laid on. Not a blaze, a working fire, kept alive and moderate, feeding it steadily so the room held. There would be a candle, or not. Sometimes work, the endless mending, or a knife whittling pegs, or wool being carded because the hands may as well be busy. Sometimes nothing at all, just sitting in the noise, watching the flame lean and recover, listening to the house. And the rest of the family sleeping behind them in the dark, 12 feet away, breathing slowly under 30 pounds of quilts. There is something in that image that seems to me the plain heart of the whole subject. Not heroics. One person awake. All night, feeding a fire an armful at a time, so that 6 other people could go on sleeping without ever knowing how cold it had got. Up in the loft, the storm is much closer. The children are 3 feet under the shakes, and the shakes are not sealed. They never were. They were split boards laid overlapping and weighted down, and in a hard wind the fine dry snow finds every seam between them. It does not come in as flakes. It comes in as a powder, sifting, drifting down through the dark, settling on the quilts and on the floorboards and on the ends of everyone's hair. Because the loft is cold, the snow does not melt. It lies there. The accounts of this are wonderfully matter-of-fact. Children woke, brushed the snow off the top quilt with a hand, pulled the covers back up over their heads, and went to sleep again. In the morning there might be a line of white along the ridge of every blanket, and a small drift in the corner where the roof met the gable, and someone would sweep it out with a broom before it thawed. They could hear everything up there. The wind directly overhead, going over the roof in long waves. The weight poles knocking. The whole roof structure taking the gusts and giving very slightly and settling back. And below, through the gaps in the loft floor, a faint orange glow and the sound of a stick being laid on the fire, which was, to a child lying in the dark with snow on the blanket, the most reassuring sound in the world. Half a century later, grown men wrote about it and could still describe the exact color of that light coming up between the boards. Somewhere in the middle of it, twice in 24 hours, someone has to go out anyway. The cow must be milked and the stock must be fed and watered, and no storm changes that. So the coat goes on, and the second pair of stockings, and the mittens, and a scarf wrapped round the face until only the eyes show. The door is unbarred and pulled inward against the drift piled against it. And the room, in that instant, changes completely. The wind comes straight in. The fire flattens. Snow whips across the floor. Everyone turns away, and the children shout, and the door is hauled shut again behind the figure going out. Outside there is no clearing, and no barn, and no sky. There is the rope and the mitten, and the ground somewhere underfoot, and the wind pushing hard and steady from one side. 60 feet of that, bent over, and then the barn wall arrives out of the white, and the door is found by feel. Inside the barn it is dim and still and astonishingly warm. The animal's own heat, held under a low roof, thick with the smell of hay and dung and breath. The cow turns her head. The work takes 20 minutes and is done half by touch. Then the same 60 feet, back, hand over hand, with the milk pail slopping and freezing at the rim. And the door, and the light, and the noise of the storm cut off behind it, and somebody taking the pail out of frozen fingers. Then a long moment standing in the middle of the room, thawing, saying nothing at all. By 3 in the morning the storm has been going for 9 hours, and the night has settled into its lowest, longest stretch. This is when the temperature bottoms out. Clear or storming. The coldest hour is always the one before dawn, and in that hour the difference between inside and outside might be 60 degrees, held apart by nothing but logs, clay, ash, and one person's attention. The room has a geography now. 2 feet from the hearth it is warm. 6 feet away it is cool. At the far wall, where the water bucket used to sit, there is frost on the inside of the chinking, a fine white fur growing out of the clay. Nails and iron latches wear a coat of it. If someone lit a candle and carried it to the door, they would see their own breath in a long cloud. But under the quilts, it is another climate entirely. For people in a bed, a foot of feathers below, wool and hide above, a stone at the foot that has not yet gone cold. In there it is close and heavy and warm, and the sleepers have not moved in hours. The one who is awake puts on another stick. The flame comes up, and the shadows swing round the room and go still. Outside, the wind does not change at all. Hour after hour, the same long note, the same hiss on the shakes. There is nothing to do but let it pass. And this is the strange thing that comes through in the diaries. They were not, on the whole, frightened. They were bored. Storm-stayed families played checkers, told the same stories, read the same book aloud, and complained mostly about the tedium. And then, sometime before dawn, everyone wakes up. Not because of a noise, because of the absence of one. The wind has stopped. It stops the way a machine stops, not fading, but ending, leaving behind it a silence so complete that it is physically startling after 18 hours of roar. No hiss on the roof. No note at the chimney. Nothing knocking, nothing straining. The person by the fire lifts their head. Up in the loft, a child opens their eyes in the dark and lies still, listening to nothing. Outside, the snow has stopped falling and the sky is torn open, and the cold that follows a great storm is the deepest cold of the whole year. The still, clear, ferocious cold that comes down out of a sky full of stars when there is no cloud left to hold any warmth in. The house is buried to the windowsill on the north side. The door will not open inward because there is a drift 4 feet deep against it, and someone will have to dig out through it later with a shovel handed through the window or over the top. But that is a problem for daylight. For now there is only the enormous quiet, and the fire still going, and everyone in the house awake for a moment in the dark, and nobody saying anything at all. And then, one by one, in a warmth they have spent all autumn earning, going back to sleep. The light that comes after a great storm is unlike any other light in the year. The sun rises into a sky washed absolutely clean, and everything it touches is white and blue. The snow blue in the shadows and blinding where the sun strikes it, the drifts carved into long, smooth curves by the wind, the timber edged in white, every branch loaded. Sound carries for miles. A dog barking on a farm 2 miles off arrives as though it were in the yard. Inside, the family wakes into a room where the fire is low and the frost has crept a little further along the wall, and the first thing is always the same. Get the fire up, then the digging. The door will not swing, so the shovel goes out through the window, or a boy goes out the window after it, and the drift is cut back from the doorway in blocks. A path is opened to the barn, and to the woodpile, and to the necessary house, and to the spring, narrow trenches with shoulder-high walls, which will stay exactly where they are for the next 2 months and become simply the shape of the farm until spring. The animals are found, and counted, and are almost always fine, standing in a warm barn with snow drifted in the doorway. And the storm, which was the great event of the week, has become a landscape. Nobody talks about it much. It goes into the diary as one line. A hard blow drifts to the eaves, and the day proceeds. Most mornings, though, were not the morning after a blizzard. Most mornings were simply cold. The order of them scarcely varied. The fire uncovered and fed. The candle lit, if it was still dark. Boots pulled on, cold and stiff, and stamped into. The water bucket carried to the hearth to thaw, or broken through with the dipper handle. Then out, in the blue half-light, to the barn, the same path, the same 40 seconds of intense cold, the same warm dim room at the end of it full of breathing animals. Milking, with a forehead against the cow's flank and the milk steaming in the pail. Hay pitched down. The horses watered at a hole broken open in the creek ice. Back inside, the room has warmed. There is cornbread or johnny cake on the hearth, or mush and milk, or fried salt pork, and its gravy poured over bread. Coffee, if there is coffee, and if there is not, then something roasted and ground to imitate it, rye, or chicory, or parched corn. The children come down the ladder in a rush, straight to the fire, dressing in front of it, hopping on the cold boards. Somebody is scolded. Somebody is sent to fill the wood box. And by 8 o'clock the house is warm and full of smoke and noise and the smell of frying pork, and the frost on the walls has retreated to the corners, and the day, which is very short, has begun. Winter is often described as the frontier's idle season, and that is not quite right. It was the season when the work moved indoors and slowed down, and went on for 14 hours by firelight. The men and boys, on clear days, were out, cutting the next year's wood, hauling logs on the snow, which is far easier than hauling them on bare ground, splitting rails, hunting, checking trap lines. Winter was when a man cleared new ground, because the timber came down easier and the brush burned better. Inside, the women's winter was textiles, and it was relentless. Wool had to be picked clean of burrs, carted into rolls between two paddles, spun on the great wheel, walking backwards and forwards, thousands of steps a day, drawing out the thread, then reeled, dyed with walnut hull, or indigo or madder, and finally woven on the loom that took up a quarter of the cabin. Flax was hackled and spun on the small wheel. Stockings were knitted in every idle moment, by every person, including men, including children. And there was mending, always, and soap making from ash lye and grease, and butter churned, and quilting, and the 200th repair of the same pair of trousers. The children were set to whittling pegs, shelling corn, minding babies, and if the settlement had raised a school, to trudging a mile or two through the snow to a one-room schoolhouse with its own iron stove and its own woodpile that each family took turns supplying. Nobody sat still. But it was slow work and warm work, and done sitting down within reach of the fire, which is about as close to rest as that century allowed. And here is the part that surprises people, because we imagine these winters as months of grim isolation, and they were not entirely. Once the ground froze hard and the snow packed down, travel actually got easier. A wagon fights mud all autumn. A sled glides over frozen ruts and drifted fields, straight across country, over fences buried to the top rail. So after the storms, when the weather sat clear and cold for a week, people went visiting. Sleighs came out, with bells on the harness, and the bells were entirely practical. A sleigh on snow makes no sound at all and would otherwise come up on a walker unheard. Families drove 5 and 10 miles to spend an entire day because you did not travel that far for an hour. Winter was when the gatherings happened, for the plain reason that this was the only season with time in it. Husking bees in late autumn, where the corn was stripped and the young people paired off. Quilting frames set up in a neighbor's front room, with 6 women around one quilt for a day. Apple butter boilings, all night around a copper kettle. Singing schools. Spelling matches at the schoolhouse by lamplight. Weddings, very often, because the harvest was in and everyone was free. And afterwards, the drive home in the dark, under a hard bright sky, everyone piled under buffalo robes in the sled with hot bricks at their feet, and the bells going, and the runners hissing on the snow. Children fell asleep in the bottom of the sleigh and were carried in and put to bed without waking. Still, there was a stretch, late January into February, that everybody who lived it recognized, and that shows up in the diaries as a kind of flatness. The novelty of the snow was gone. The visiting slowed. The same food came out of the same barrels, day after day: salt pork, cornbread, beans, dried apples, potatoes, and less variety with every week. Fresh milk thinned as the cow went dry. Vegetables from the cellar softened and sprouted. Scurvy was not unknown in the worst provision households by March, and people craved greens without quite knowing why. Sickness came in the close air of a shut-up room. Colds moving through a family one after another, croup in the children, agues and fevers, the rheumatism of people who had worked outdoors in the wet for 30 years. The remedies came off the rafters, in bunches: bone-set tea for fever, pennyroyal, horehound and honey for a cough, an onion poultice on the chest, whiskey for almost everything. The cabin, which felt snug in December, felt small in February. There was nowhere to be alone. The same 8 feet of floor, the same faces, the same fire, the same 14 hours of dark. And yet the record of it is remarkably even-tempered. People did not, on the whole, write that they were miserable. They wrote about the weather and the wood and who had come by. They had grown up expecting winter to be long, and it was long, and that was the arrangement. The thing to do was to keep the fire going and wait it out. If you want to know how a family felt in the middle of February, you do not read what they wrote. You look at the woodpile. By then it has shrunk to perhaps a third of what it was, and the shape of the rick has changed, and everybody in the house can see it every time they go out for an armful. There is an old, quiet frontier arithmetic being done in the back of the mind. How many weeks of cold are likely left against how many rows of wood remain? If the pile is holding, the fire stays generous and the room stays warm and nobody says anything. If the pile is going down too fast, the household tightens without discussion. The fire is kept smaller. The family sits closer in. Doors are open less. Somebody goes out on the clear days to cut more, though the standing timber is now green and buried and the snow is waist deep around the trunks. The same slow accounting ran through everything else. How much cornmeal in the barrel? How much hay in the mow? Against how many weeks until the pasture greens? How many candles left in the box? How much salt pork still hanging? It is a way of living with numbers that has almost entirely vanished from ordinary life. Nothing could be resupplied. What was in the house in November was what there was. And in a good year, in a well-run house, it lasted just, and there was a little left over at the end, and that was considered a fine thing and remembered. Then, one day, without any announcement, something changes. It comes first as a sound, dripping. Snow melting at the south edge of the roof in the middle of the day, water running off the shakes and freezing again into a fringe of icicles by evening. The path to the barn goes soft at noon and hardens at 4. The drifts pull back from the base of the walls, and the leaves and corn stalks of the banking appear again out of the white, matted and gray. In the maple country, this is the moment the whole year turns on. When the days go above freezing and the nights fall below it, the sap runs, and the family goes out into the sugar bush with an auger and spiles and buckets, and tends a boiling fire under a long pan for days on end. 40 gallons of sap to 1 gallon of syrup, boiled down slowly, tended around the clock, filling the woods with steam and wood smoke and the smell of it. It is the first sweet thing since autumn, and the first fresh thing of any kind, and children were given it hot, poured over clean snow to set into a soft candy. Elsewhere the signs are smaller and just as watched for. Water in the ruts. Bare ground under the big trees. Geese, very high up, going north. The cow restless in the barn. Green tips in the sheltered south corner of the garden, weeks before anything is safe to plant. The winter is not over. There will be more snow, and one more hard freeze, and one more storm that catches everybody unprepared. But the direction has changed, and everyone can feel it. And so, in the end, comes an evening in April when nobody banks the coals. The door has stood open half the day. The bedding has been out on the fence in the sun. The frost has gone from the corners, and there is no ice in the water bucket, and the great back log, which has been rolled to the back of the hearth every week since November, is not replaced. The fire is let down to nothing. The ash is finally swept out and carried to the ash hopper for soap. The hearth, for the first time in 6 months, goes cold and stays cold, and the room grows quiet in a new way. The family will cook outside now, on a fire in the yard, and eat with the door open. The children will sleep with 1 quilt instead of 5. The winter clothes will be washed and put away in the chest with sprigs of herbs against the moths. And the cabin, which spent the winter closed and buried and dim, opens up again, leaves and cornstalks raked away from the walls, window unstuffed, everything aired. They did it something like 60 or 70 times, some of them, over the course of a life. Bank the fire in November. Let it go out in April. Cut the wood, salt the pork, mend the chinking, tighten the ropes, and get everybody through to the other side. It was not remarkable to them. That is the part worth keeping. It was simply the year, going round again, exactly as it had for their parents, and would for their children, in a small warm room in the middle of a great deal of cold. And so the fire burns low, as it has on 100,000 winter nights. The coals are under the ash. The door is barred. The snow has stopped falling in the clearing, and the woods have gone quiet, and everyone in that small warm room is asleep. And perhaps, by now, so are you. If you're still awake, that's perfectly all right. There's nowhere you need to be. Nothing you need to do. The night will go on without any help from either of us. The archive will be here tomorrow night, as always. Sleep well.